I think we should begin. We'll do it a little chronologically. We're going to do a little bit of an introduction into Mary and the fathers of the church, but it's going to be both connected to the feast that's coming up, the feast of the Assumption or the Dormition of the Mother of God, as well as, of course, looking a little bit at the biblical background, just to have an idea of this person of Mary and how the understanding that the church has of Mary grew and evolved, because it's not simply limited to the biblical context, but has grown a little bit beyond that. And so we'll begin with the liturgical hymn that in the Byzantine Church is sung for the feast of the Annunciation, which is really the beginning of God's plan of salvation. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Today is the beginning of our salvation, the revelation of the eternal mystery. The Son of God becomes the Son of the Virgin, as Gabriel announces the coming of grace. Together with him, let us cry to the Theotokos, "Rejoice, O full of grace, the Lord is with you." There's a little bit more to the story of Mary, and as we addressed some of that from our study of Joachim and Anna and the text of the Proto-Evangelium of James, of St. James, that text gives us, of course, Mary's background. And as a text of the early church, and this is going to come up today in some of our conversation, the text of the Proto-Evangelium is very, it is contemporary to the Gospels. And so it has an ancient background that is a little different from some of the sources that are, part of the church's tradition for the Feast of the Assumption or Dormition. And so as a text, it focuses on Mary, on her parents, and on the circumstances around Mary's birth and her early childhood, her engagement to Joseph, and that's kind of the gist of that text, or the focus. Hence, it's not focused on Jesus. So today we're starting with the Annunciation because this is biblical. So this is coming straight from the gospel tradition. Now, in looking at the feast of the Annunciation originally was called, in Greek, it was called Evangelismos. And you can hear the gospel, evangelium, is in that word, evangelismos, which is based on the verb. So it is an active verb. And it literally means the good news. And so it is you could almost say that it's the delivery of the good news. And so that is kind of, I think, in what we have in English, and also then coming from Latin as Annunciation, that kind of does contain, it is meant to be a translation of the Greek. Although I don't think we quite hear that same type of terminology of taking the good news as actually being not the object that you receive, but rather it is the good news is the action itself. And so, so it is Greek doing what Greek does. Greek creates expressions, taking, nouns and making them active. That, of course, some of that, when we read the Fathers, some of that becomes a difficulty because it's hard to translate that kind of stuff. And sometimes it also causes mistakes and misunderstandings in what the Fathers are writing, because the Greek is so malleable. However, as far as our understanding of the Annunciation, I think it's important to understand the expression for the feast, because it already expresses this action, this movement of God, which does not consist of the text of the Gospels, but rather it is the very incarnation of God in the body of Mary, beginning, with his being conceived within her womb, that the good news is already in full swing and movement. So it's not just about the destination, resurrection or of a gospel text, but it is the entire movement that has this energy about it that is about God's plan. And God's plan is always in movement, always energizing, always energy. And so it's interesting, the use of that word really takes us, I think, to a deeper understanding of the feast itself. Now, there are, from the Annunciation, we talked about the patristic approach to the way that the Fathers analyzed the biblical text. And one of their favorite tools was the use of allegory, which means they read something in the biblical text, Old Testament, New Testament, Psalms, and they saw within that text a connection to something else. And so, there are two very important themes that the Fathers connect from the very event of the Annunciation. Firstly, they connect Mary to this text. And these should be familiar because they appear in many early Christian prayers that are still prayed today. For example, some of these titles are a part of the Akathist, which is a 6th century Eastern Byzantine liturgical prayer service to the Mother of God. But many of the things from the Akathist are then echoed by, in the West, by the litanies to the Mother of God, and as a long list of titles, many titles being biblical. From the Annunciation, the one that the Fathers connected to, the two, I would say, that they connected to the strongest was, firstly, Jacob's ladder. And Jacob's ladder is taken from Genesis chapter 28, verse 12. And he dreamed that there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And the Father saw that because there is a separation between that which is heavenly, and hence divine, and that which is earthly, and even though God dwelt among his people, so to speak, in the place of the temple, the Holy of Holies, but also he led them out of Egypt as in the nighttime as a pillar of fire, and during the day as a column of smoke. And so God was present in that way among his people, the fathers still recognized that there was a separation. After all, even Moses, when he went before God, had to take off his sandals, had to cover his face, and then even the priests who serve in the temple in the presence of God had to be set apart. They were not just the regular people who, volunteered to serve in the temple, but they were chosen from a specific bloodline, a specific tribe. And then in order for them to participate or to go into the Holy of Holies, they had to remove themselves from their regular daily lives and spend 40 days of fasting and prayer in preparation to go in. And so the communication between humanity and divinity, between the earthly and the heavenly, was not fluid. There was a separation, and there were certain, you could say, agents who served as kind of temporary connections or bridges between the godly and the human. And so this image of Jacob's ladder, which of course, ironically, and the fathers saw this because they were very sensitive to the Jewish background of the Old Testament. They saw the irony of this dream of Jacob, and yet when humanity attempts to create a bridge to God, they fail. That of course is the Tower of Babel. And so Jacob's ladder then becomes almost this different kind of way of going between heaven and earth, between the human and the divine, and the presence of angels in this vision render it a passageway that is more permanent. So it's not just a temporary, momentary place and point in time where divinity and humanity connect. The latter is much more permanent because the angels are a part of it. And of course, where there is angels, there is God. And so the fathers saw Mary as being Jacob's ladder. That they said that Jacob, in his dream, he actually prefigured that what he was talking about was, in a sense, a prophecy of Mary, alluding to she who would come, and that she would be the one who is set up on earth and yet reaches to heaven. And the angels of God were ascending and descending upon her. You can replace the ladder with the image, with words and pronouns about Mary, and that's exactly it. After all, didn't the Archangel Gabriel descend to Mary? And so the fathers saw that, you could say, is one of the oldest images that refers in the mind of the church and the fathers to Mary. Now, you might ask yourself, based on some of the other things that we have spoken about in past months, you might say, well, why didn't they just call her the Ark of the Covenant? After all, wasn't that the primary symbol of the presence of God among his people? And the reason for that, the reason why the Ark of the Covenant was not just yet used, was because when this image became a part of the church's kind of meditation on Mary and her importance, the temple in Jerusalem still stood. the Ark of the Covenant was still inside the temple in Jerusalem, or at least that is what most of the Jewish people believed. And so that symbol was not just a symbol, but a reality. It wasn't until the year 70 that the temple in Jerusalem would be destroyed. And then at that point, the temple, the ark, all of that imagery would slowly be applied to Mary, slowly, because it wasn't as immediate for the church. That took a little bit longer to understand, but you can see that understanding starts to be developed in the text of the Proto-Evangelium, because that beautiful story about Mary being brought as a child into the temple, the encounter with the temple, that is already the church beginning to ponder on Mary's role, and if perhaps she is the successor to the temple. Even though by the time the temple was destroyed, according to church tradition, Mary was already deceased, and so already assumed into heaven. And so I think perhaps that's one of the reasons why the application doesn't come immediately. Temple gone, now we apply it to Mary, because both the temple was gone, but Mary also was already not with the church. And and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. So Jacob's ladder is this first image. The second image that we get from the event of the Annunciation is this title that is given to Mary, the Virgin of the Sign. And it is an icon also, but this, which is called, maybe we shouldn't call it the Virgin of the Sign so we don't get it confused with the icon. The icon is the one that shows Mary with her hands outstretched in the prayer position, and in front of her is usually like a circle, a mandorla, which contains within it Jesus as a child, kind of within her womb. And that is the icon of the Virgin of the Sign. But speaking biblically, the title that is given is the Sign of Isaiah. And so Isaiah, and this is where this comes from. Hear then, O house of David, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. That is, God is with us. And so that is, of course, looking at Isaiah's prophecy as being, well, firstly messianic, which it was, and also being a very clear sign about how this would happen, because it says a virgin will conceive. So that sign is something which is not the common, normal, usual way that a child comes into the world. Now, one of the things that does come up very often, and so I don't want to ignore it, but very often, especially with some groups like Protestants, so they're not too thrilled with the translation that the Catholic and Orthodox churches use, which translates the word, the Hebrew word from Hebrew scripture is Alma, and Alma means young woman, with the understanding that she is unmarried and hence a virgin. So it's a loaded word that because this becomes a word also in defense of Mary's perpetual virginity. And so this reference then takes on a greater importance, because as Catholics and also Orthodox hold the same belief that Mary was a virgin before the birth of Christ, during the birth of Christ, and after the birth of Christ. And so it seems like the text of Isaiah actually bolsters that claim, that belief. And so the Protestants bring up, of course, well, in the Hebrew scriptures, blah, blah, blah. The word that is used in Hebrew means young woman. But they discount the fact that it means young woman who is unmarried, and because she's not married, is a virgin. Because in order to have a good marriage within Jewish society, the young woman would have to be a virgin. That was considered normal and necessary according to Jewish tradition. And so they kind of ignore that. Now, so how then did we as Catholics, and also how did the Orthodox get the translation that says virgin? Because it seems a little bit of interpretative liberty to jump from the literal translation of young woman to virgin. And this is how it happens. 200 years before the birth of Christ, in the city of Alexandria, Jewish leaders recognized there was a need for a Greek translation of the Old Testament. And some of the books, not the whole Old Testament, but what was popularly being used within the Jewish tradition at that time. And of course, that included prophecies, that included the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and it also included the Psalms. And so this Greek translation became fundamental for the early church, even if the Protestants might not want to admit that. And so the translation that was made of the word Alma, of the Hebrew word, into Greek, the translation was the word Parthenos. And the word Parthenos in Greek means virgin. So its primary meaning is virgin. So this happened before, 200 years before the birth of Christ. And so it's not, it's not Constantine or some pope trying to translate the Old Testament conveniently so that it works for the teachings of the church. This is actually how it happened and where it came from. And of course, the fathers didn't question it. They didn't say, well, it's a mistake, because that was used as the translation. It was not retranslated. It was not undone. In Greek, there are words for a young girl who is unwedded. And so this was a very specific choice. And again, the fathers recognized that perhaps God in some way was, even through this translation into Greek, that God was revealing himself and preparing the world for the mystery, the unfolding of the mystery of the incarnation. The sign is very much important in that sense, because it connects directly and Isaiah has a lot more of his prophecy that does speak to details and connects intimately to the coming of the Messiah and descriptions of Jesus. There is much to take from his prophecies which does elaborate on who this Messiah will be, how he will reveal himself. But this specific piece, this sign, is tied directly to the image of Mary. And so the Feast of the Annunciation becomes that place which provides the first titles, the first allegorical prefigurations, prophecies about Mary. Because, the fact of the matter is, in the early church, especially as we will go forward a little bit and see some of the development among the fathers, Mary in the first centuries is highly respected and regarded. However, a lot of the dogmatic understanding that we know and celebrate today, a lot of that came about a little bit later, because obviously the focus was on Jesus. And so the understanding of Mary was secondary in the mind of the church to our understanding of who Jesus is. The other New Testament image, which I think is very important, is the Magnificat. The Magnificat is this biblical point of encounter where Mary, through her own words, connects herself to Isaiah, connects herself to the Old Testament. And, and the fathers, in reading this, I think they considered this probably one of the most important New Testament texts about the person of the Virgin Mary. And so I will read this so you can listen to this, because from all the things that Mary said, this is the most important. This text is the most important, reveals to us her mind, where she was, what she understood. And this comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, beginning with verse 46. My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior. For he has regarded the low estate of his handmaiden. For behold, henceforth all generations will call me blessed. For he who is mighty has done great things for me, and holy is his name. And his mercy is on those who fear him from generation to generation. He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts. He has put down the mighty from their thrones and exalted those of low degree. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty. He has helped his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy, as he spoke to our fathers, to Abraham and to his posterity forever. And this text is clearly we see the reference, the Old Testament, but why the fathers love the Magnificat. And there are many things in the New Testament which are beautiful hymns, things which Jesus has said, things based on biblical texts, and of course Psalms, and yet the Magnificat in the church has become a part of daily prayer. It is prayed in both the East and the West every day, specifically in monastic settings. And so, that gives you an idea that the fathers really thought this was something special. And the specialness of this text comes in the fact that Mary, when she recognizes through her words, through the inspiration working of the Holy Spirit, she recognizes that she is connected intimately to the Old Testament prophecies, to Israel, to Jacob, and to Abraham, and she recognizes also that God's plan reveals itself in a way that exalts the lowly, that it takes people who are unexpected and powerless and weak by the world's standards, and makes them great for God's plan. So she says all these things, which, for a teenager of 14, probably 15 years old, this is an incredible amount of insight. But the key, those words which for the fathers and for the church became very important when Mary says, "Behold, henceforth all generations will call me blessed." And it's not that she is somehow showing off or even proud. It is simply the recognition of all of us. And so it is, in a sense, in this one prayer is kind of this beautiful package of all of God's plan of salvation. From the Old Testament, Abraham, the promise, to Mary, and then she sees us. So it's because of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is revealing this to her. And so the fathers, the church, saw in the Magnificat this incredibly powerful theological profession of faith, prayer, this, Mary's clarity in understanding her place within God's plan of salvation. And that's, I think that's one of those things which is it's one of those wow moments, when you pray the prayer word by word and actually get into it. You realize that as you pray it, so you're praying with all the posterity of Abraham, with all of the fathers of the Old Testament, everyone who is waiting for the coming of the Messiah. And then you're praying with Mary, who, the simple young girl who is thrust through her, she is thrust into the middle of the mystery of the Incarnation. And then, the icing on the cake, she looks out at each one of us, and brings us directly into the prayer. And so it's a wonderful moment of continuity, connectedness, interconnectedness. No matter how we might feel that we might be isolated or removed from historical people like Mary or Jesus, when you really read this and pray this, so there is that mystery that through God we are all intimately interconnected, and that's why she sees us. And and that, of course, that I think that builds wonderfully then in all of these through the centuries, apparitions of Mary and things like that, where she has spoken and expressed that concern for humanity. It's like, it seems very natural that she would be close to us. And of course it is then, I think, that closeness is affirmed when Jesus entrusts her to John. This is your mother, and he's saying that to John, but he's also saying this to all of us who have come to know her through the Gospels and through John. So the connectedness does get affirmed a few times. And I think, this is one of the things too, I do want to bring up Isaiah also, in, the prophecy, which is quite detailed and many layered. There is in chapter 25, verse 8 of Isaiah, a beautiful passage of consolation and ultimately resurrection, which points to Jesus, but also points to the upcoming feast of the Mother of God, the Assumption, the Dormition. Isaiah writes, "He, God, will destroy death forever. The Lord God will wipe away the tears from all faces. The reproach of his people he will remove from the whole earth, for the Lord has spoken." It's beautiful. He will destroy death forever. That is an incredibly charged statement. And of course, when it comes to as Christians, so we see that fulfilled in Jesus, and then we also see it fulfilled in the person of Mary. So this basic biblical background of Mary is then followed by I mentioned we're going to look at some of the fathers, and so I'm going to briefly run through the fathers. I do want to shamelessly plug a book. This book here, Mary Through the Centuries, is written by a now deceased Lutheran historical theologian who, once he retired, he converted to Orthodoxy, to Christian Orthodoxy. His name is Yaroslav Pelikan, Pelikan. And this book, Mary Through the Centuries, her place in the history of culture. He writes really beautifully, giving us almost it's not too full of theology. It's balanced out between the history, the development, other things that were happening, and then what the fathers said. He also wrote another book called Jesus Through the Centuries. And this book, actually, I found this one at Half Price Books for $6.99. So they are still available because I've seen them quite a bit. He is very popular because historical theology reads easier than theology very often. And so since he gives a context, it makes it a little more understandable. But it's a good starting point for understanding the development of many of the things that we believe. And he himself is not a polemicist. He doesn't go into, why the Protestants believe this and who's right. He actually gives quite a bit of information on Catholic perspectives, including a rather extensive reflection on Vatican II and how that has also developed Mariology, which Mariology is the study of Mary. But returning to the fathers of the church, the earliest fathers really focused more on Mary's sanctity. So biblically, they had a couple of these images which were important: Jacob's ladder, the sign, the Magnificat. These were very important markers, you could say, in the development of our understanding of Mary's place within the mystery of the Incarnation. And, understandably so, today, so as Catholics, uh, it's very difficult to imagine our Christian faith without Mary. So much so that Mary is somehow almost central to our understanding of faith. And of course, we see the Protestants as being the exact opposite, where they try to remove her so that the focus is she's just kind of a footnote, and sometimes even less than that. But the early church had a different relationship with the reality of Mary, and that that relationship, that understanding, was not based on any antipathy or any conflict with Mary. It was just based on the fact that the church was a suffering church, underground. The texts of the New Testament were orally transmitted. Remember that the New Testament doesn't come together until the first half of the 4th century under the sponsorship of Constantine the Great. And so those first 300 years after the resurrection and ascension of Jesus, those first 300 years were not easy. And so the luxury of focusing on Mary or on other people in the New Testament tradition, or even on Peter, on the apostles, on the saints, the luxury of focusing on them was not a real thing, because they recognized the urgency of knowing Jesus. And so everybody else took a back seat to that reality. And so Mary's life, the details, like from the Proto-Evangelion, they were conserved within the church, but not necessarily focused upon. They would be dipped into later. And so we see there's a couple of different things that we can find in the earliest of fathers. So I'm going to go through just a couple of them so that we can kind of historically mark the development. So the Alexandrian fathers, Alexandria and Egypt, specifically Clement of Alexandria, who was a great philosopher, and Origen. Both of them speak about Mary, and they, of course, use the word virgin. And so they see perhaps what could be taken as more of a Jewish understanding of Mary's virginity. So they are focusing on her purity as being part of her encountering God in an intimate way. That someone who would be imperfect or defiled, someone who would not be holy, and holy, the understanding is full of grace. So they're actually taking it right from the words of the Archangel Gabriel. They see that her virginity, her purity, her holiness is about her, but it is a preparation for the intimate encounter with God that occurs when he forms within her womb. And so they don't focus so much on some of like the later theological arguments and even some of the words that we see coming up later on. But it is, they basically see that Mary is pure, She is full of grace. They understand Origen specifically makes reference to Mary's journey to see Elizabeth, where she goes into the hill country, into the hills, as being an expression of Mary's ascent into perfection. And so they see it as a process that is happening within her, and that the Bible then expresses in these little details. Origen specifically does compare Mary to Eve, but he makes a little bit of a distinction. He calls both Mary and Eve as mothers of life. The distinction is that he sees Eve as being that mother of, you could say, biological life, but ultimately her motherhood ends in death. Whereas Mary's motherhood leads to everlasting life and the perfection of life. And so he kind of plays with that theme a little bit, but it's a theme that's going to be picked up by later fathers. But again, they play it simpler, because Mary is not that much of a focus at this point. Now, in the 4th century, of course, we see the legalization of Christianity. The year 313 AD means that Christians are no longer persecuted, and Constantine becomes the sponsor of St. Helena's building of churches and finding of relics. And so at this time, we see a bishop named Epiphanius of Salamis, and he lived from the year 310 to the year 403. And he wrote actually quite a bit about Mary, and coined some of the terms that we see then reflected in the teaching of the church, echoed by different theologians, including in the West, Thomas Aquinas, Bernard of Clairvaux, and in the East, St. John of Damascus, as well as Theodore the Studite, and many others. And so he writes, this was apparently part of a homily that Epiphanius gave. And so I'll just share this a little bit, because you'll hear the contemporary issue, at least for us today, but you'll also hear, of course, the terminology of old. To pass on to the New Testament, if women were appointed by God to be priests or to perform any ministerial function in the church, it was Mary herself who should have discharged the office of high priest in the New Testament. She was thought worthy to welcome in her own womb the absolute monarch and heaven's God, God's Son. Her womb was prepared in God's love for man, and by an astounding mystery, as a temple and a dwelling place for the incarnation of the Lord. So it's interesting how, we like to say that with some of the ongoing discussions, that happen in the church, and we're like, oh, Vatican II caused that, now everybody wants this, blah, blah, blah. Well, this is from the mid-4th century. So apparently it's been a hot topic for a while. But the main thing, he brings it back to Mary and focuses, gives us these images: temple, dwelling place for the incarnation of the Lord. And the translation here, absolute monarch, that is Pandocrator, that is the ruler over all. And so the English translation is a little weaker. And then Epiphanius also, he liked this expression which he used about Mary, where he said that she was graced in every way. And this is the Greek doing what the Greeks do. He's taking the word grace, and which is a noun, and he is using it as a verb. And so but it's a beautiful expression again, because it makes it very active, energetic, and flowing. And so you can almost see that then, in everything that Mary does, she is graced. She is full of grace. And, and that gives it's not just that moment of annunciation, but it is, all of her life, every moment, all that clarity. And so, and these references are, they become, a part of the church's language, how we speak about Mary. And so if you go to like the texts in, for any of the feasts of the Mother of God from the breviary, Vespers or Matins, in either East or West, and when you read some of the prayers and hymns that are sung, so you'll get a taste of some of this terminology that, was coined by Epiphanius of Salamis, or by Origen or Clement of Alexandria, because these were the first expressions that departed from biblical talk. Because Jacob's Ladder, the Magnificat, the sign of Isaiah, that's Bible talk. But these are this is the next level. This is where the church is doing what the church does. It is explaining, it is illustrating, it is teaching what we believe. And so, Epiphanius also speaks very clearly about Mary's perpetual virginity, because that's also been a hot topic. And at this point, the church had not yet made any declaration as to Mary's perpetual virginity. That would happen in the Council of Ephesus. And so let me share with you another little section of what Epiphanius wrote about the Mother of God, about Mary. And this is contained in an extensive library of books that is called the Ming Patrology. And they are, I don't know, it's got to be 100 books, 100 volumes of patristic texts, where these are usually in like seminary libraries. A lot of these have not been translated into published books, but rather reside in antiquated old copies of Ming. And Ming is spelled, I think, like M-I-G-N-E. It was originally published in the original language with a French translation. And so this comes out of that text. Mary, the Holy Virgin, is truly great before God and men. For how shall we not proclaim her great, who held within her the uncontainable one, whom neither heaven nor earth can contain? And now this is the precursor to what would become then one of the titles of Mary. The title came after this. So this is written around in the second half of the 4th century, after the Council of Nicaea, probably around the time of the Council of Constantinople, the year 381. And this wonderful, beautiful expression where he says about Mary, who held within her the uncontainable one, whom neither heaven nor earth can contain. This is where we go back to the icon of the Virgin of the Sign. And the Virgin of the Sign with her hands outheld, outstretched, praying to Jesus who is in her womb, depicted in the mandorla. That icon is referred to the Mother of God, wider than the heavens. And it's platitera ton uranon, wider than the heavens. And the explanation that is given for that is because she contained within her body he whom the heavens cannot contain. And so logically, using Greek logic, that renders her in a theological, mystical way wider than the heavens, because she could contain him who cannot be contained by the heavens. And so so we have this very beautiful expression, which again comes later, but Epiphanius is already giving us the definition for what would become then common knowledge, a commonly used theological expression about Mary. And then he also writes here, and this is I think a very beautiful expression. Whoever honors the Lord also honors the holy vessel. Who instead dishonors the holy vessel also dishonors his Lord. Mary herself is that holy virgin. She is the holy vessel. So beautiful expressions, from a father whose books have become a part of the theological language of the church, and yet like these original texts are not commonly available because they've only been relegated to seminary libraries and this old collection of patristic literature. And yet, in no way, if we had all of this published, I mean, it's an incredible body of early Christian literature. And this terminology, holy vessel, that word vessel is used like in the Marian litanies in the West. And it is echoed in the Akathist too. So it's not something that was forgotten. It is a part of the language, even though we're not directly quoting Epiphanius of Salamis. Then the next father, who is, I think, very important for our understanding of Mary, is Saint Ephrem. And Ephrem is a wonderful, wonderful author and father and teacher, because he's so in touch with the common everyday Christian. Ephrem was a deacon. He belonged to the church in what is today Asia Minor, specifically the Archdiocese of Edessa. And in this, where he's from, that place is the border between Turkey and Syria, and was decimated in these wars with ISIS, and the Christian presence there was also decimated. Most of the Christians moved from there. And yet this place was one of the earliest Christian churches. And it was a thriving church. And he starts his career as a layman. He studies theology with monastics. He is taught by bishops who were themselves teaching and writing. And he becomes, in his diocese, a very contemporary job description. He becomes a director of religious education. And he takes that as, so his job was not like, many times the DREs today have many other things that they're occupied with, working on organization of catechetical school years and who's doing what and which texts we're using. His experience was much more hands-on. It was a early missionary church that was growing. And so he wrote and taught, he wrote prayers. And then as a hobby, he composed hymns, many hymns which we still sing in the church, many hymns which are attributed to him, which appear in the West in the breviary, and which in the East appear as part of liturgical feasts. And he also was a choir director, and he started a tradition that is still preserved within the Syriac churches, so the daughter churches of Antioch. And he started the tradition of women's choirs. And because it was, a different way of singing than men. And so he composed hymns for them to perform. And of course, the language of his writing is Aramaic. And that is the language of Jesus. And so a lot of the things that he expresses have a keen sensitivity to Judaism, because Aramaic was the language that was used by the Jews and by the rabbis. For example, many of the writings that are used to explain the Old Testament from the period around the time of Jesus are written in Aramaic and not in Hebrew. And he has a familiarity with that because he writes using some of the terminology that is used exclusively within Judaism and not part of Christian common theology, at least in Aramaic. And so Ephraim has, of course, he takes Mary's sanctity and he takes it up a notch. So while sanctity is the goal of all Christians, Mary's sanctity is something that the rest of us can't really attain. And it is because her connection to God, her preparation to become a part of the mystery of the incarnation, all of that points to sinlessness. That her purity is not the purity that we have, where we fall and we clean up. Her sinlessness is an inherent part of who she is. So he's almost saying, without saying it, that she can't commit sin, that she is not connected to that part. She can't partake, participate. She can't, it's just not of her nature. Now, that, of course, what does that sound like? Well, that sounds like what's become the Immaculate Conception, in definition. But it sets the groundwork for what in the West would become Immaculate Conception. In the East, it's a little, I would say it's not as defined, although one could say that it is implied. And so that purity, but it finds its foundation in the writings of Ephraim. And this is one of the texts where he does explain and teach about Mary's sinlessness. You alone, referring to Jesus, you alone and your mother are more beautiful than any others. For there is no blemish in you, nor any stains upon your mother. Who of my children can compare in beauty to thee? Ephraim compares the purity of Jesus, which is, of course, connected to divinity, where divinity has absolutely nothing to do with impurity and sin. He connects Mary's state of purity to Jesus. So where the purity of Jesus is inherently a part of who he is as God, it is a trait, a characteristic that belongs to Jesus because he is God. He says that Mary's purity is dependent on her connection to Jesus. So it's not part of her nature, but rather it is something that she has received because of Jesus. So how it happens though, see, this is the one he won't get into, because this is just kind of the beginning stages of that development of Mariological theological thought. And we go on and we'll find in the other fathers, we'll find, of course, St. John Chrysostom, St. Basil the Great, Cyril of Alexandria. They all contribute to the growth of the understanding and theology about who Mary is, and it's through theology, through the analysis and meditation of her place within the mystery, that we can understand more about who she is. The main reason for us addressing this theme of Mary and the Fathers is because we are in this period of preparation for the Feast of the Assumption. And the Feast of the Assumption has a history that, of course, is not biblically based, because there is no account of Mary's death and burial and assumption. And even in the early church, there seems to be kind of a pieces parts telling of that part of her story. Now, we know in the Roman Catholic Church, the dogma that is associated with the Assumption was declared on November 1st, 1950. And the document is called Munificentissimus Deus. And it is something where you can actually look it up and read. But I will share with you a little piece here, because it gives us something that helps understand. So then this is a direct quote from Pius XII. It is the understanding of the Church that the Immaculate Mother of God, Mary, the Semper Virgo, when the course of her earthly life was run, was assumed in body and soul to heavenly glory. And so one of the interesting, I guess, issues that has come about is there is a little bit of confusion about Mary dying or Mary just being assumed into heaven. And, firstly, the expressions that are used in the earliest church. So the first expressions we hear are in the 6th century in the East, and then later on it comes and is translated into Latin. And the words that are used are dormition. And dormition literally is just a translation, is the falling asleep. And this was the one of the most common terms used in the church to express death. So it was not actually meant to be a term that didn't recognize death. It was a way of showing continuity, that one falls asleep to this life, waking up to the life to come. And so it's not that there is any sort of a division between this life and the life to come, but rather there is continuity. And so just like one falls asleep at night and wakes up in the next morning, and that is still the same life, the same thing happens when one passes away, falling asleep to this life and waking up in the life to come. And so dormition was used to indicate, express that understanding of continuity. In Latin, a number of other words also came up. Transitus, which was for the expression of Mary's death. It was, you could say it was like a transfer from this life to the life to come. But also, it also has an understanding of movement, of a physical movement. And so transitus was also used to express the movement of her body being taken into heaven. And of course, the other word that is used in Latin is translation, to translate from one place to another. And that, again, that one pointed much more to the understanding of her body being moved from one place here on earth to heaven. Now, the early church, though, began to form kind of a collection of stories about Mary's dormition based on the pieces and parts that could be found. The Council of Ephesus, for example, did not address any issue of Mary's death or of her assumption. And so Ephesus, which was considered, the Marian Council in the year 432, Ephesus gave us specific terms about Mary in her relationship to Jesus, and that includes the term Mother of God, and then the term Theotokos, meaning she who gave birth to God. And however, that doesn't mean that there already wasn't, a speculation or even some stories that were preserved within the church. So we find the oldest texts that directly speak about the death of Mary and her assumption are, there are 3 primary texts, all translated into English. They all are from the 5th century, and the authorship is attributed to someone, but it's not by them. So go figure. Now, all that means is that they probably were texts that may have been based on writings from that specific father, or they were somehow that father became associated with it. So the first one is called The Tale of the Dormition of the Virgin, and it is attributed to St. John the Theologian. And however, it is not from that period. The text and the style of the Greek is very clearly from the 4th and 5th centuries. And then the two other texts that are used are called De Transitu Virginis Mariae, about the transit, the transfer of the Virgin Mary. Same title for both texts. One is attributed to Melitone of Sardis, who is one of the well-known fathers of the Greek Church, and the other one is attributed to Dionysius. Neither of them wrote these texts because, again, the Greek is clearly not from the period that they lived in. And none of this was I have to emphasize, none of this was done to somehow, fool people or give the text a greater claim to fame by association. It was simply the way things were passed down. Very often, different fathers were attributed with different things that they, didn't do or may have somehow influenced without having directly written them. But these texts from the 5th century, they are the ones that then we see used and cited by other fathers. So, for example, in the 7th century, a monastic, Hippolytus of Thebes in Egypt, so he wrote about the celebration of the feast of the Dormition of the Mother of God. And he also, in his writing, he also quoted texts that he had found in libraries and monasteries in Egypt, and that told us a little bit more about the life, the death of Mary, and specifically, he gives us the year of the death of Mary as being 41 AD, so 11 years after the resurrection and ascension of Jesus. And then we see, so the feast is celebrated in Constantinople beginning around the year 600. So it is not, it's not a feast of primary importance at that time. However, after, all of the development of Christology, I think that the church begins to appreciate more the person of Mary. And then this is where the focus on the details about the life of Mary come. And so the fathers go looking for different sources which would speak about what happened. And it's also interesting. So we have, for example, the tomb of the Mother of God. We know where she was buried. So when you go to the Holy Land, you can go to the place where Mary died, which today is a Benedictine monastery run by Benedictines from Germany, and that is in the city of Jerusalem, overlooking the Garden of Gethsemane and the Kidron Valley. And then you descend from her house, which would have been St. John's house. You descend to the valley right next to the Garden of Gethsemane, and descend into her tomb, which is, as was the tradition, caves that were used. And this site has been a part of, Holy Land travels from the 4th century. And so it is an ancient site. And the church which holds her tomb is run by the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Jerusalem and the Armenian Orthodox Patriarchate of Jerusalem. and I guess since they were fighting over it, so they alternate days. And those of you who have been there can see the joyful collaboration between the two. Joyful, reluctant, call it what you want. But as it's interesting that it takes on more of an importance. So the early church knew where she was buried without having developed a feast day for her death, and without having gone into all of that. All of that happens much later, and it happens because of a very interesting reason, that Mary takes on this role of the first among us human beings, where Jesus is risen from the dead. He's God. So, there's no question how that's going to happen. But then, he makes the promise. He promises resurrection, and Mary is the first one. And so in her, and this is where the church comes to the conclusion, beginning in the 6th century, they're like, oh, that's why this is important. Because she again becomes the first. She's the first follower of Jesus, the first Christian. So she is that model in so many things. Model in collaboration with God through her yes. She participates in making God present, and that's what we do as Christians. We make God present through how we live our lives. So she's always the first. And now she is the first human being to die. And then she is resurrected and returned. Her soul is united to her body again, and she is in paradise. And so she is the proof that the promise of Jesus is good and will be fulfilled. Now, the basis of the story, so the different writings, the 3 primary texts, they basically give us this story, which I'd like to share with you. It's a kind of a synthesis of the 3, so that you can get a sense of what the church believes. According to tradition, Mary, having spent her life after Pentecost supporting and serving the early church, was living in the house of the Apostle John in Jerusalem when the archangel Gabriel revealed to her that her death would occur 3 days later. The apostles scattered throughout the world are said to have been miraculously transported to be at her side when she died. The sole exception was Thomas, who was preaching in India. He is said to have arrived in a cloud above her tomb exactly 3 days after her death, and to have seen her body leaving to heaven. He cried out to her, "Where are you going, O Holy One?" At which she took off her belt and gave it to him, saying, "Receive this, my friend," after which she disappeared. Thomas was taken to his fellow apostles, whom he asked to see her grave, so that he could bid her goodbye. Mary had been buried in Gethsemane according to her request. When they arrived at the grave, her body was gone, leaving a sweet fragrance. An apparition is said to have confirmed that Christ had taken her body to heaven after 3 days to be reunited with her soul. The church's theology teaches that the Theotokos has already undergone the bodily resurrection which all will experience at the second coming. And she stands in heaven in that glorified state, which the other righteous ones will only enjoy after the last judgment. So that's the synthesized, that is the Cliff Notes version of those three texts that kind of come together. They're not it's unfortunately, it's not quite a seamless garment, because in the church's history, of course, with these kinds of feasts, so there is some people, some theologians have kind of implied that, well, if Mary was spared from sin, then she would be spared from death, because after all, death is the ultimate experience of sin, or the fruit of sin. And it's like, that I don't know about that one, because technically growing older, aging is a part of that. So she experienced some of the human common shared elements of the result of sin. But the other thing also, I think that we have to say that Mary's death became the opportunity for Christ to fulfill, first in her, the promise for all, and secondly, Jesus died. And so that's, I think, kind of the bigger thing. So by saying that Mary didn't die because she was preserved from sin, well, what does that say about Jesus then? Because he did die. And so it would, in a sense, if you're going to follow kind of the logic of philosophers, it would almost render Mary greater than Jesus. So it's like, no, that's got to be, there has to be a continuity in that. And so that becomes one of the issues. The other issue is that it's become very popular in Baroque art, for example, to depict the Assumption of Mary, where it is not her body that is being assumed, but she's like alive. Her eyes are open, so there's kind of, that becomes a little messy, because the understanding is that, and this is what we see in the oldest images of the Assumption, the Dormition Assumption, whatever you want to call it, the oldest images starting in the 9th century, we see clearly Mary is laid out on a bier, dead, and Jesus stands over her holding a what looks like a little child wrapped tightly like a mummy. And that is an image of her soul, because that is the definition of death. Death is the separation of the soul from the body. And so right there in the oldest images, east, west, doesn't matter. You'll find it in Rome, you'll find it in Constantinople, east, west, it's the same image that shows death. The separation, Jesus holding the soul on top of the body, there is space between the two, that is death. Now, of course, the image shows also, in some of the oldest images of the Dormition or Assumption, we'll also see some of the fathers of the church depicted, fathers who wrote about Mary, as well as we'll also see images of the prophet Elijah and the prophet Enoch, because both of them in the Old Testament tradition did not die. And so they have they again are given that kind of like they prefigure in their life, they prefigure what was to come through the resurrection. but they didn't have that fullness, which we see demonstrated in the life of Mary. And so some of that, I would say, gets a little confused artistically, but the church's oldest tradition speaks of that separation, and then her body being brought up by angels, brought up to heaven, and then being united with the soul again and brought to life as the first of those resurrected by Christ. And so, that's really, I think that's one of the main reasons for the importance of this feast, because, indeed it is about the fulfillment of the promise of the resurrection. It's a resurrectional feast. And when we gather in many churches, there is a tradition, in both Eastern and Western churches, there is a tradition of carrying images of the Mother of God. In Italy, they carry statues of Mary in death, adorned with flowers, because that's part of the story. Part of the story is that when Thomas comes to Jerusalem and is taken to the tomb by the other apostles, they open the tomb and they find it empty, and all they see and smell are flowers. And so, that's become a part of that, the way the feast is celebrated. And the other thing that is also done on that feast day in churches, both Eastern and Western, depending on which part of the world, of course, there is a blessing of herbs, because bodies that were prepared for burial were anointed with aromatic oils that were made from different herbs. And so, these were all symbols in one way of preparation of the body. And on the other hand, the flowers were already a kind of a foreshadowing of paradise to come, the fulfillment of the promise. Any questions?
Blessed is the kingdom of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, now and ever, and forever. Amen.
Ephesus is just, it is one of the places where she lived with John when they traveled. And, but it was not, she did not die there. That's not the church's tradition. And actually, by going to the Holy Land, you can see the church's tradition in full glory. It's not a speculated site. When you go to it's called Dormition Abbey, and that monastery that the German Benedictines built, you go down into the crypt, and there in the middle of the crypt is a beautiful statue of an icon, basically, but it is a statue of Mary laying in death. It is like made as a wake, so it's and that tradition is within the church is very, very old. These places have been marked and venerated really from the 4th century, when Christianity was legalized. So all these places were preserved. I wish you all a blessed journey to the Feast of the Assumption, the Dormition. It is in the Byzantine Church. It is a 2-week preparation period where we fast, although it's a simpler fast, but it is a period where we listen to and pray some of the ancient hymns of the Mother of God, including the Paraklesis, which is a hymn of supplication to the Mother of God, and which is prayed every day. And especially with all the things going on in the world, it's, I think, a good idea to turn to Mary and to pray to her, pray with her, that she guide us, that she help us, and that she ask Jesus to take all of this away. Okay, well, have a good evening.
Blessed is the kingdom of the Father,